So, given that this book talks a lot about alt food systems, I was thinking we could start by grounding the audience in a definition of it that you have from the book. So, in the book, Nancy says, unlike the commodity food system where corporations aim to get a single product from producer to consumer as cheaply and efficiently as possible, the key word in alt food system is the word system. It is predicated on networks that mimic nature in their diversity, complexity, and mutually beneficial arms and nodes. Often, we only need to look at ancient indigenous food culture for a glimpse at what we've lost and what we might return to, which I thought was a beautiful definition. And so I just wanted to start by asking you, why did you want to write this book and why the focus on these very specific alt food systems?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. Thank you. First of all, it's just a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Sayer and to Carolyn, the librarian here, for always making this such a welcoming spot. I'm just delighted to be here with Richa and to be in collaboration with Slow Food NYC as well. So I've been writing about agroecology and food systems and food sovereignty for many years now. And I think what I was thinking about for a long time is how do we pull more people into this world that we are true believers in, but most of the world is not. And when you write short articles, like my friend Lily's here too, we write short things and we don't go very in depth. And so I think people have sort of a feel-good conception about terms like farm to table or sustainable or even regenerative, but don't have a really deep understanding of what those terms mean. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to have sort of like a two-pronged approach here. On one level, I want to tell really compelling, interesting narrative stories of these amazing women who I've met along the way, who are doing incredible things in agriculture, who are very passionate about restoring land, feeding people, really doing things that a food system should do. And in opposition to them, you know, it's a very big agricultural agribusiness world. So on the one level, I wanted to tell these interesting narratives that would sort of draw people in and then sort of get them with this, frankly, really nerdy story about dueling supply chain systems. And so you have the regenerative, organic, regional, transparent, direct, equitable of these alternative alt food systems. And then in stark opposition is big ag and big food, which are the exact opposite. They're very long chain, they're very opaque, no transparency. They're very extractive, they're very global. And I really felt like, sort of like, you know, a little bit of sugar making the medicine go down. You draw people in with a narrative and then say, look, there's this whole supply chain thing going on. And I really felt the time was maybe right because of COVID, like people even knew what a supply chain was. And so that was kind of the starting point, what I was thinking.
And why the focus on women specifically?
Yeah, well, it really, everyone I talked to said, yes, this is the right angle. But when you think about it, you know, it's like any other sector of the economy. Women make less. They tend to be not the people who are inheriting farms. They're not the people who have access to credit, not the people who are in the CEO positions. And they're more on the margins and the periphery. And this is where innovation happens. This is where change happens. Women are also, I have one great quote from a source of my book who said, when women control the food system, everyone gets fed. No one goes hungry. It's about cooperation, not competition. And it's about caring for people. The UN has recognized women as important drivers in food systems if they are enabled. And a great example, I just gave a talk at NYU in the food studies department. So most of the people, it was a packed room, most of the people were students. Every single student in there was a woman. Wow. And it was just more proof of what I'm writing about.
Yeah, I also loved in the chapter you had on like meat and cows and poultry and things like that, also that example of a woman who was able to better relate to like even like tending to cattle, because it's like you have that same kind of
She's like fifth generation dairy family. She said it wasn't until I had children that I get it, you know, we're lactating animals. You know, I get that maternal thing. But yeah, there's a very powerful women energy in this movement, I think.
Yeah. And speaking of powerful, the title is also very powerful, Reaping What She Sows. What does that mean to you personally?
It's kind of a nod to a 1947 book. I mean, it goes back to the Bible and the New Testament, you know, sort of the idea of whatever you put into the soil is what you're going to take out. But in 1947, a social anthropologist named Walter Goldschmidt saw the industrialization of the American food system. And he wrote a social anthropological study on the effect of agribusiness in the Central Valley of California on 3 distinct communities. And even then in 1947, you had 20 million farmers. You had only maybe 20% of them who were benefiting from all of the farm and the food subsidies that were going to agribusiness. And what he showed is the fabric of these communities eroding and declining. So this has been going on a really long time. It's not exactly new, but I just kind of wanted to sort of give a nod to that.
Yeah. So as we've been talking about, this book covers a lot about like all food systems and many different sectors of the food system. So comparing these short, kind of like small, direct and resilient short supply chains as an alternative to the more extractive commodity food system. But the first chapter of the book is actually a little bit different. It's about African American cooperatives and those of World War II Japanese American prison camps. So what was the rationale behind starting the book with that chapter?
Yeah, it's a good question because every other chapter of the book covers a sector of the food industry. So meat, dairy, grains, I have a whole oceans chapter. But the first chapter is very different, and I wanted to think of it as sort of a roadmap or a blueprint to this alternative or all food system that I'm advocating. And so it's about the African American Southern United States cooperatives of the post-emancipation era. And I also briefly mention the World War II prison camps that my family were in. And in both cases, you're talking about a completely disenfranchised people who have no form of officially sanctioned government support. You're basically cut off, you're on your own. And I wanted to demonstrate, you know, so you can think of the alternative food system as it's an analogous situation. And what do people do when they have no support? You have to turn to each other in the form of mutual aid societies and cooperative enterprises. And there were really some amazing things going on in both of these areas. So in the Southern United States, there was this kind of co-op of co-ops called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And it was a lot of small cooperatives of Black farmers who couldn't get loans, who didn't have money to buy farms. So they aggregated their strength and their power 10 years after their founding. By the way, they were founded in 1967, and you really could think of this as the agricultural arm of the civil rights movement, because there was so much violence against African Americans during the Jim Crow era. And this is when the Student for Nonviolence Coordinating Committee was organizing, and the woman in my chapter, her husband was one of the key organizers of that, and they both started the first land trust, new communities. Anyway, so 10 years after the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was formed, they were overseeing 1 million acres of farmland. And it was about aggregating savings, about helping each other with technical advice, getting equipment together, really combining their resources, which is exactly what the Japanese Americans did. the prison camp that my father was in for part of his time in prison during World War II was called Manzanar, and it was in the high desert of California. There were 11,000 people there, and they started a prisoner-run cooperative. Became very successful. It was, of course, entirely run by inmates, and they were doing the equivalent in today's dollars of $14 million a year in business. And this was only one of 10 camps across the western part of the United States that were, sorry, I'm not looking over here, just to try not to look at the light and not ignoring people over here. Yeah, I just wanted to say, look, it has been done before, people with no resources, no support. It is possible, and this could be sort of a roadmap to the rest of the book and what these women are trying to do.
Definitely, yeah. And I think it was so powerful the way you weaved in your own kind of family history into the broader history of just the US and different kind of groups. So in each chapter of the book, between grains, meat, fish, even like cacao and kind of coffee and all of that, we see the same patterns, right? So market consolidation, growing monopolies, and small producers that are being squeezed out of business, and how the alt food system producers are all facing a lot of similar challenges. Was showing these themes deliberate on your part?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's the same story in chapter after chapter, increasing consolidation, monopolization, which the government is not stopping from happening. It's really the free market is, going to take care of everything, which just doesn't happen. And small producers are squeezed out. And by showing how it happens in every single chapter of the book, you see these patterns. And again, one of the reasons of trying to show these two systems in stark reality is to convince the reader that they have agency and they now understand, because it's a big ask. A lot of people will say it's harder to buy organic, it's not as easy, it's more expensive. Why should I do that? Well, the whole book is like, this is why you should do it. And so when you see these patterns of business and big versus small, and the horribly extractive nature of these commodity food systems, so much of climate change is driven by our food production. 1/3 of greenhouse gases is food production. So we really have to pay attention to how our food is being produced, who's growing it, and what methods they're using. So more than ever, the climate reason is pressing, and another reason to really shift your food buying behavior. But yeah, it was very deliberate. And again, I thought, okay, I'm really pounding the people over the head with this supply chain thing, because it really is about how these women, in order to compete with something this large and this efficient, big ag spent $500 million in the last 5 years to lobby around the Farm Bill. When you think of how you can buy legislators with that much money, these little alt food system women, they need help, And so it's just trying to show the context of what really is happening here. And so many people don't even realize they're in this big agriculture, big food bubble, because it's the world we live in.
Yeah.
And it's hard to like pull the scales off your eyes.
Yeah. And I think the other thing you did that was really effective too is like there are a lot of hidden costs to the way that the food system works today. So climate is one part of it, and then the other part of it's also healthcare, and the fact that so much of the cost goes there because of the kind of poor nutrients that comes from the food that comes from like commodity food chains. So obviously being from Slow Food, I do have to talk a little bit about it. So the Slow Food mission is focused on creating a food system that's good, clean, and fair, which translates to principles of high quality taste, environmental sustainability, and social justice. So I do think this is very correlated to kind of the alt food system and the work that these women are doing. But how do you think the book speaks to this mission and how these small, resilient, short supply chain alternatives can help get us there?
Yeah, I mean, I think my book's message and the slow food message are completely in sync. One of the things that I've always liked about slow food is there's an emphasis on the pleasures of doing things in sort of the old world, old country kind of way. where you're really appreciating where your food comes from. You're not rushing. The whole idea of slow is, I think, really key. And I like the way you give these snail
of
approval, right? Snail awards. And I was just looking like this regenerative distillery and this urban farm, and these are places that could be in my book, you know. So I think our messages are totally in sync. I think the difference maybe is just I'm trying to show this holistic systems point of view so that people really have a more nuanced understanding of what's happening, not just on the farm, but with government and politics and why the deck is so stacked against. And I just wrote a Substack post about plastic. And I said the way that my book intersects with this is there are all these hidden subsidies that are going to the oil industry and the plastics industry. And we don't see those. And so, you know, that's why we're being inundated with plastic when no one wants it, but we're being, you know, it's being pushed on us. So yeah, I think we're totally in sync. I wanted to go back to this whole externality thing. Like in my book, I say that the externalities, the cost of our global food system is $12 trillion a year. So there's a more recent Eat Lancet study, very reputable study, that puts the price tag at $15 trillion a year. And we're talking about environmental damage that has to be cleaned up. But we're talking about health outcomes. We're talking about chronic diseases like obesity and cardiovascular disease that are all caused by big food and these very extractive and very unhealthy food system.
Yeah, and I think similar to what you were saying about plastic too, it's like a lot of it does come from all of this subsidization that happens. Like there's so many government dollars that go towards corn and soybean production when it could be rerouted to these like women and the amazing work that they're doing. So
yeah. And you know, it's kind of happening under the Biden administration. Like $40 million and almost all of it got rolled back. You know, there was climate smart grants and, you know, a lot of money. I mean, just a trickle compared to what the giant subsidies are, but at least it was kind of moving. And now it's all gone. So, you know, kind of back to square one. Yeah. It's very frustrating.
Yeah. So this is shifting gears a little bit, but I think many of us, especially kind of in the slow food movement, interested in this kind of work, would be interesting to know about the growing category of regenerative beverages. So can you tell us a little bit more about that chapter and how your subjects are combining regenerative agriculture with the brewing, fermenting, and distilling of beverages?
Yeah, thank you. That's one of my favorite chapters. I like to talk about it. I guess number one, I'm interested in drinking and beer, and my last book was on sake. We have some sake fans here, and so I was very immersed in that world. I always look at it as an agricultural product, and so when I was writing, it's called Exploring the World of Japanese Craft Sake. I point out we're talking about an agricultural product. Having the farmers as part of that book and having a chapter on organics was very important to me. You know, it's a kind of a nascent movement in the sake world, but it is important. So, you know, one, I was interested. Two, when you think of the millions upon millions of acres of land that are devoted to cultivating grapes for wine, corn, barley, rye for whiskey. I did in this chapter, I include two women who make mezcal in Puebla, Mexico, and the amount of monocropping, extractive agave growing that is going on is really, really sad. And so in every sector, there's this sort of wrecking of the ecosystem, and that is being done through beverages. So if you think about that, and if you think you can start turning those fields into regenerative, that's very powerful, moving the needle forward. So that was part of it. And then there are just these amazing women. I talk about wonderful beer brewer, Dandy Boss Febo, in St. Paul, Minnesota. And she is brewing beer with the regenerative grain Kernza, which is sort of the poster child for regenerative grains because it's developed from an ancient grass. It has, I think, 12-foot long roots. It's really what the Midwestern prairies were all about before cultivation, which then led to the stripping of the topsoil. And when the Dust Bowl came, it was because all of that extractive agriculture had been done. So the University of Minnesota is working with the Land Institute in Kansas, which is an amazing organization that is trying to bring back or perennialize different brains. The idea is that you never have to pull them up. So you're increasing the ability of the soil to retain water. So it's much more drought and flood resistant. And you're sort of bringing back soil health, very, very badly treated soils. So she figured out how to make this delicious beer with Kernza. Patagonia Provisions is now doing a 1% Kernza. And it seems like such a small amount, but then when you think about the amount of beer that people drink, devoted 1% of that grain to a regenerative crop like Kernza would make a huge difference. And then there's this wonderful winemaker in California, Alice Anderson, who is so passionate about having animals on her land. So she's growing grapes with ducks and chickens and sheep. So she's regenerating the soil. She's making it more climate resistant, and she can see the difference between the organic plots and the non-organic, the really old ones, and how, she's telling me about these long stretch of like 110, 118 degrees days, and these really old organic lines will sail through, and then the new ones where the soil has not been treated that way for very long are very different. So it's very visible to people who are farming this way. And then the two women doing the agave too, that was really incredible to find such passionate women who were really trying to regenerate.
Yeah. It's crazy that Kernza is native to this country, but I had never even heard about it until
it's kind of developed, they developed it, and they're still developing it to make it to make the yield better. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So also given the fact that, as we talked about, the deck is so stacked against these women, what do you think drives the women to do what they do?
Oh gosh, they're so amazing. I mean, I just love the women in my book. I think they really are passionate about their land. They're passionate about their animals. They love feeding people. They really believe that, to have a good future and to leave a healthy planet to our children, this is essential work. And they're not picking it because they're making a lot of money, because as you see, it's so hard. And so I think what I wanted to show is how hard it is. I think sort of the secret ingredient that keeps a lot of women growing is the immense amount of satisfaction that they get from community building, from feeding people. I talk a lot about these thought and knowledge networks that are now possible because of social media. So for example, in the grains chapter, there are all these amazing bakers who are really trying to bring back regional grain sheds, and they're networked throughout the world. My friend Dawn in Toronto goes regularly to the Washington State Bread Lab, which is famous for being one of the leaders in bringing back whole grain and whole grain baking. She is on a WhatsApp group called Imagine Biscuits, and there's bakers around the world. And when I was going to London, I said, Dawn, where should we go? She said, okay, visit, this bakery and this bakery. They're doing exactly the same work. And so there's a lot of joy in the community building, and really feeling like they may be small individually, but when you're connected as a network and you're sharing techniques and knowledge, you can really start to aggregate strength and make a difference.
Yeah. And you touched on this earlier, but we often hear complaints that eating healthy or organic is too expensive, it's too difficult to access. Can most people access the foods of these women and the stories they tell and what they're growing and producing?
Yeah, I mean, the equity piece was really important to me writing this book. I really believe that one of the tenets of the alternative food system is it has to be accessible to all, that everyone should have access to healthy and nutritious food. So many of the people that I talked to were concerned about that and were addressing it in different ways. Of course, it used to be that if you had SNAP benefits, you could go to a farmer's market. All of that is sort of in danger. But some of them who had been doing this for a really long time and building this kind of incredibly powerful community have instituted basically a pay what you can kind of thing. And one of them said there's this beautiful bell curve where people who can afford are paying more, and people who can't, and it's all about taking care of each other in the community. And so that's one thing. But I talk about a lot of different ways that women are trying to bring equity. One of my favorite parts is in the produce chapter, going to Hartford and visiting with these 4 women who work in really different areas. One was a former food policy council head, one worked for a big healthcare network, one was a community activist, and one was an academic. So, for example, the food policy former head realized that some women had to take, 3 buses, 2 transfers in order to get a decent amount of wholesome food for the family. So she worked on getting the bus routes changed, so it's easier, only 1 bus route. Another woman has been lobbying for a long time for a full service grocery store in North Hartford. The one in the healthcare system was working on this food as medicine, which is one way to get greens and vegetables to people who maybe can't afford to have it all the time because it's prescribed to them. And so they were able to get it. And then in tandem with that, they had this whole community health program that involved teaching about nutrition and cooking. And it was very outcomes based. So they're measuring results when you go through this program, and they're collecting the data. And then when you graduate, there was a forest bathing component too. Like you had to walk a certain amount in nature. And then when you graduate, you will become a peer counselor to other people. So really, it's just about how are we going to work as a community to feed everyone. And I think it is very important to everyone that I met that was figuring out, how to make it more accessible. But I also talk about things like, okay, if you don't have a lot of money, first of all, the best thing to do is to cook your own food, to buy whole foods, to don't buy packaged foods. You're not getting, you don't want to get any, you're paying a lot to get ultra processed food, basically. So you're saving a lot of money there. If you grow your own food, that's also a very economical way. If you can't, try to go to your local farmer's market. And then like in the meat chapter, I talk about, you don't need a big piece of meat. You should have mostly vegetables and you can cut way down, but then think about where you're sourcing from so that you're sourcing in a way that's going to be regenerative. And when you read about people in this chapter, you'll just think, oh, I would want to support them instead of big meat, big poultry, whatever. So yeah, various different ways. I also talk about things like one of the farmers, her son opted out of the meal plan in his dorm. And then the whole dorm floor got in touch with a local farmer and said, hey, we want to put in, with our meal dollars, we're going to put in an order. And she, being a farmer, said, oh, farmers would be so thrilled to get a regular bulk order that they might even deliver it to you. And then they all started cooking together. It was a really fun bonding experience. So they were like saying no to, the meal service and then saying, we're going to do our own alternative food system right here.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And they apparently had a really lot of fun.
I think something else you touch on, which kind of relates to that. So let's say you're a consumer, you learn this is what you wanted, this is how you want to put your dollars, you want to get food that's good for you, that's grown through the system. But I think there's also a lot of confusion now where kind of big ag or corporations have seen that this is what consumers want. And so there's a lot of greenwashing, there's a lot of fair trade labels or things that seem like you're getting something that you're actually not. So how do you think consumers that are interested in doing this are able to differentiate between that and choose food that actually is coming from the systems that they want to support?
Yeah, it's a really good question because it is a huge, the amount of greenwashing. I don't know if some of you may have read the paper about JBS and Tyson, talking about, oh yeah, we're doing regenerative this and that and the other. And thank God for Letitia James, they no, you're not. They investigated it, and there were different examples of how they made people pay a lot of money who were lying about it. So I can't forget how many, much money had to go into regenerative farming. So, it's good to have enforcement, but the amount of greenwashing that's going on is so huge. It is sort of buyer beware, but I quote someone saying like, look, you can't be perfect. Like if you thought I've got to like be perfect down to the last thing I buy, there are things you can do. I mean, there have been a lot of consumer lawsuits against people in the cacao industry. I spoke to this woman in Chicago who is sort of doing a lot of that kind of investigation because cacao and coffee are very long chain and very not transparent, and just investigating. So even just like Googling a company and seeing if there have been any sort of lawsuits or consumer complaints about their claims. One of my coffee sources said, look, the more you see on the package about where it was sourced, who grew it, the better. Like if you just say like 100% regenerative or something, that's it. How can you believe that? And she said, if it's like too good to be true, like she sent me a packaging of, I think, Kirkland organic coffee, and she said there's just no way that this is possible. So if it's too good to be true, it's probably not true. That was one of her things. And also I talk in the book about the many different certification programs that are going on, and even that can be overwhelming because everyone knows they have to have some sort of certification. And I talk about one that I thought was really good, Regenified, because it's two like the top kind of like regenerative farming experts who were behind this, and I know them and I know that they're very honest. And then the other one was regenerative ROC, regenerative organic certified, that Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's and Rodale all decided to come together and make this certification program. And then I was on this podcast called The Real Organic, and they're like, extreme, like they hate hydroponics. They don't want, a lot of urban gardens are doing that. And then I forget what it was, but there was something like, but Regenify is not doing X. And I said, okay, I don't know what to say. But I mean, it's very hard, but I think as much as possible, know your producer, try to find out as much as you can about them, and do the best you can. I mean, I belong to a food co-op. I really highly recommend food co-ops. I'm on the food issues committee, and we actually write articles about where your toilet papers come from, what are these certifications, and which ones should we buy? And because we're a bunch of people who care about these things. So I think everyone has their different comfort levels, but you can learn a lot just by doing your own research and seeing what's out there.
Definitely. Okay, last question for you before we turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So we've already been talking about this a little bit, but just if we had to distill it, how can readers be a part of the shift from an extractive long chain commodity food system to more resilient all food systems that are better for our health, the environment, workers, and animal welfare? So how can we all help move this needle?
Yes, we're all gonna do it.
Try to
my editor was like, yeah, they love the actionable. We were all trying to talk about actionable items, but yeah, I mean, it's anything from, does your community have a food policy council? I was excited because we have someone from the Mayor's Food Policy Council here. So, if they don't, can you start one? Can you be on it? Can you go to your local supermarket and say, hey, how come you're not sourcing from this local farm that I know? Can you make space for them? Can you make space for this other local producer that I know is really good? You could, institutional procurement is one of the biggest ways that you can sort of make change on sort of a bigger than just your individual line. So if your child isn't in a school, that you can say, can we talk about where you get your food from? There was a great $10 million farm to school, is that right? Farm to school program just got canceled, and it was a lot of places were doing it where they were getting medium local farms to go to supply schools. There's a wonderful organization called the Common Market in Philadelphia. Do you know that one?
No.
They're completely in the mid-sized farm range, and they deal with like 250 farms in the Philadelphia area. So a lot of the big universities in Philadelphia, with the help of the common market, are getting all of their produce from these small and medium organic farms. So, maybe there are things like that going on in your community. There's 100-kilometer company where everything is local. You could even get involved in farmers market operations. Schools, I think teaching children and having community gardens are so important because you're really sort of teaching the next generation to care about where their food comes from. In Japan, it's so amazing the level of food education there is. I've gone to some of these Japanese elementary schools, and they put it there, it's part of the curriculum. The one I went to, they were all having a little project on their family's miso soup recipe and what part of Japan it came from, and they had photographs and recipes. And the children served the food, and each classroom has its own food together. The children serve that, they stand up, it's like being in a fancy restaurant where they talk about what all the ingredients are, where they were sourced from, and they're like little elementary school students, but it's the culture, and so you grow up caring about these things. So I don't know, I think I try to put in a lot of things like that on every level where you can make a difference and try to be part of it.
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, for me, reading this book, I actually did feel hopeful, seeing like all these women and the food systems that they're working within and the community that they're building. And just like the awareness, like the fact that this room is like so full, because I do think there is more awareness.
I do think people are getting it more. Yeah. So that's hopeful. Thank you so much.
Of course. Okay, I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience if anything has.
Leila.
So thank you, Nancy. That was really fantastic. It strikes me that in other parts of the world, there is at least a voice for small farmers. France, they shut down roads, and the global south, we have Via Campesina and other peasant groups. Whether or not they have a ton of power is, a question for another time. But in your travels through the States, have you seen any kind of even informal sort of coming together of some of these smaller producers to give themselves more voice?
Not like the Campesino or that, but in Europe, no, nothing like that. The things that I've gotten most excited about are, for example, I mentioned the University of Minnesota and the Land Institute, and they have these sort of community-based initiatives. One's called Blue Waters, Green Lands, and one's called Continuous Living Cover. And so they're advocating the practices of regenerative agriculture, but they're really trying to think about how they bring in local food producers and make them have a role. So you can do good and make a profit. You can be part of the system, and they help them plug into, okay, this regenerative farmer is doing X, and you want to make crackers or bread, and how can we? So again, it's that really hard work of building the resilient local supply chain. So at every point, you have to have someone who's doing the milling, who's doing the farming, who's doing the value added product. And so when you see people thinking in this holistic systems point of view, whether in a community-based and this is sort of like, it's a university that's also very much about the local community. And so I guess that was the closest thing. And then, individual networks like the seafood people, they have their own national network called Local Catch, where all the small CS, like consumer supported fishery type people, are all talking to each other and having conferences. There's a wonderful woman in my book who's a professor at Memorial University in Newfoundland who started this global organization of small fisher folk. And her tagline is, we may be small individually, but in the aggregate, it's kind of like, peasant farmers, they're 80% of agriculture. And so if you can aggregate the strength of all of these small people, then you have a chance to affect policy and, they're fighting for their lives, against big fish. And so I did see organizations like that. and I tried to highlight them where possible. Thank you.
I'm wondering if the tariff legislation has in any way maybe even provided openings for small organic farms as our prices of the mainstream foods in the supermarkets are going up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great argument for we need our local, regional, and small and medium food system, because then you're not importing or exporting. There's you're just people have started realizing that these very long globalized food chains are kind of a matter of national security, not just food security, because if we can't feed ourselves, and I think the whole world is waking up to this fact that we can't rely on other countries, and especially when you have a crazy president who's slapping tariffs on all over the place. If you don't have to go across borders, you're that much better off. So I think in that sense, yeah, it's helpful.
Tacking on to your comment, when you started this book, the world was a different place, our political administration was in a different place. Now that our country's leadership has taken such a strong stance away from all of the things that you're advocating in your book, what gives you hope on sort of a national scale?
Thank you, Natalie. That's a hard question. I know, because the tide has turned. Again, it sort of takes me back to the Jim Crow South, where you just basically don't have any kind of government support or help. And all the more reason for grassroots efforts. I think change has to come from the bottom, not from the top. And that's the whole point of me writing this book, is trying to get people to wake up to the fact that, no one is helping us change a really toxic and unhealthy food system. And it's all the more important now with climate change, and people really, their heads buried in the sand about what's happening. So what gives me hope? I just think, the stories in the book, the organizations that I talk about, people who are just doing the work, even though they know that what they're doing is very difficult, and just trying to find strength in numbers and knowing about each other. I do find that whenever I go to any kind of, I don't know, whether it's a slow food event, or I was at this farm in Rhode Island, and it's very joyful because people do feel like we're sort of the underdog, and how can we help each other, and how can we make connections. Some of us in this room are in a group called Pleiades, and it's all about really helping each other. And I just love the fact that, my book comes out and everyone wants to, how are we going to amplify it? How are we going to help people doing different things? And that's the kind of activity that it takes. I'm not saying it's going to be the same as having a huge amount of government funding, but you have to start somewhere. And it's I think just doing the work and being among people who are doing this was very it gave me hope in the way that Richa was saying the book gave her hope. You just have to, everyone has to be talking about it and working on it. Thank you.
Unless anybody else got a question. I'm wondering about the role of vegetarianism and veganism as overlapping with these topics, because I think through much of the 20th century, when those ways of eating were associated more with a kind of crunchy granola lifestyle, they were associated more with a whole food sort of thing. But now, and I say this a little from personal experience, I admit it's very easy to be sort of a junk food vegetarian, to be a junk food vegan. There's so many processed non-local foods, which are often, very tasty and well made and are vegan, whatever, but are not at all local, are not necessarily sustainably sourced. How do these things intersect?
Yeah, I think you're totally right that you can be vegan and vegetarian and be very unhealthy.
Mhm.
I mean, there are so many ultra-processed foods that are vegan or vegetarian. In the meat chapter, I talk about how the statistics are that over 80% of people who try to go vegetarian or vegan go back to eating meat. So we're not that good as a people at adopting vegetarianism or veganism. I mean, the percentage on vegans are even, worse. But and then, there was that period where our plant-based alternatives were really kind of considered the answer. Everyone was going to stop eating meat because we had all these delicious plant-based alternatives, and that really lasted like maybe 2 or 3 years through the pandemic. And then all those companies started to go bankrupt because people were concerned about, oh, actually, there's a lot of ultra processed ingredients in here, and it's actually really expensive. And then on top of that, everyone just wanted to eat the real thing. So, it didn't work. So my point in that is, okay, we're not that good at not eating meat. So what we have to do is think about what the type of meat we're eating, how it was farmed. And it's surprising how many women in my book were former vegetarians who now, I mean, like some of them, I don't know if you saw the picture of the woman with, with that big slide of beef. She's a former vegetarian. The woman who makes salumi in my book, who talked about apprenticing in Italy and being up to her knees in pig guts. And like she was like, what did she say? I was the neck and tail girl or something. I mean, she was chopping out parts of former vegetarian, and then she discovered this whole, nose to tail, whole foods, regenerative thing, and then all these people, they think, oh, okay, so this is sort of like the circle of life. And if I'm going to eat meat, I need to take care of the animals, and I need to be the one cutting them up. And so it's very common. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but it's interesting the way. But I mean, you're right. Historically, when you think about health movements in the past, it's kind of vegetarian. But they didn't have ultra processed food back then. It was simpler to be vegetarian and just eat a lot of nuts and vegetables.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Carmen, wanted your opinion on some of the stores we have, Trader Joe's and the Whole Foods, whatever. I mean, what are your favorites?
I don't live in New York anymore. I actually live in Canada now, but I'm American and I grew up here. I used to love Trader Joe's because it was so much less expensive. I mean, I think if you are thinking about really trying to support local, organic, and regenerative, you're probably not going to go to Trader Joe's or Whole Foods very much. But again, I was talking to someone at New Seasons Market, and she was like their sustainability director in Portland. It's a really considered a very ethical, but then it got bought out by a big corporation, and it's kind of started to slide a little bit. So, but what she said to me really rang true is that, look, we all have budgets. We don't have unlimited funds to buy every single organic thing in the grocery store, so we're all prioritizing. And she said, I see people doing it at our store all the time. You might decide, okay, ethically and regeneratively produced meat is a priority. I'm going to eat a very small amount of it, but I'm going to buy it from, like Corey Carmen, who's in my book, or someone who you really know their practices. And then, you can't be perfect on everything else. And, no one is saying you have to be. So everyone's making decisions. And so I'm not saying, I go to stores like that too. I go to Whole Foods. We have one producer in the book who actually sells through Whole Foods, but she's kind of grandfathered in because the business has been around for 40 years. They're of a scale where they can meet sort of the software and a lot of the demands of a large grocery store that you can't if you're a small producer. So again, after Whole Foods was bought by Amazon, I think it changed a lot. I think we all have to keep looking and keep making our own value judgments, and also, what we can afford. But really, I think if you're thoughtful about it, you can try to. I go to the farmers market every week, and I try to buy as much from there. But I'm supplementing it. I mean, I know some people who actually buy everything from the farmer's market. That would be difficult for me. So everyone is at a different point and it has a different budget. So I just think, try to do what you can.
People complain about, I do farmers market.
I do farmers market.
Treasure shows. But I think that a lot of people that spend so much money, they find the farmers markets too expensive. I find that shocking.
Yeah,
Emotionally so wonderful.
yeah. I mean, we'd all be better off if we had our own garden and grow our own. But yeah, I mean, part of the book is explaining why these things cost what they do. We're paying for the ecosystem's repair. We're paying for being small and not efficient, like a giant tomato grower, in Arizona. We're paying for all of those things that everyone has gotten so dependent on, cheap food. But the reason why it's cheap is because they're doing a lot of bad things. And so at what point do you feel comfortable paying those things and of those prices? And where are you going to try to make a difference? There's so many hands. Okay, right here.
One of the other challenging things that you did mention, and I'm a consultant with, providers who take care of a lot of marginalized pregnant people, birthing people. And it's, what other types of examples that you may have seen regarding this type of industry and this type of work regarding food as nutrition, food as medicine, when it comes to those really, very difficult groups in our system.
Yeah, there was one really good program in Hartford that there's a really good organization called Red Tomato. They are a food hub. I don't know if you know them, but they don't have any infrastructure. So they're basically sort of distributing food that's grown locally and organically to different places. And the Martha Page, the woman that is in my book in Hartford, she was talking to one of the founders of Red Tomato, and she said, these $10, heirloom tomatoes, like who can afford them? What are we going to do? So they started this program called the Bypass Program, which connected, these sort of lower income communities directly to farms. And the idea was they were bypassing the middleman. And oftentimes these programs start with a certain amount of philanthropic and grant funding. And then you're trying to create these, basically the supply chain and get it to the point where it's eventually affordable. So there are people really thinking about this access thing and coming up with different ways of doing it. But that's just one example.
Yeah, thank you.
Being that I've worked in food policy, I'm always thinking about the systems transition.
Yeah.
As a city, we spend about $500 million a year on food procurement, like institutional food procurement. And so we adopt things like values-based purchasing to align with the kind of system that we want to support. But what we've heard often is, especially from farmers and growers in the region, is that the transition from being in the industrial food system to a more sustainable one is exceptionally risky, and it takes a long time to make that transition. So I'm curious from your conversations with farmers who have already established these more sustainable, resilient systems, often growing from very small and building up, how do we also create opportunities for some of those folks who might be in the debt cycle because of their larger adoption of these systems? How do we support them in transitioning to more sustainable?
Yeah, it's really true. It has a name too. It's called the Valley of Death. It's considered like a 7-year period where you're not going to be profitable, and how do you get through that?
Yeah.
I would recommend the meat chapter of my book. I have a section on a farm in Minnesota called Tree Range Farm, and it's a Guatemalan farmer who founded it. And they have a really smart plan that sort of takes them through that 7-year period. And they have a multi-storied farming method, the way they would do in the jungles of Guatemala. So you're not just having chickens, but you're growing, in their case, whatever's native. Was it hazelnuts or some kind of tree? They have chickens, and so they have different income sources, and they have it planned out. So on year X, this income kicks in, and year X, this can, and then they have a nonprofit arm that is Meanwhile, getting funding sources from both government and corporate. And so it's a whole economic plan basically to allow farmers to get to profitability. And so some people are thinking about that. Some people said to me, look, the government just has to pay for the transition. When you think about the enormous subsidies that are going to corn and soy, it would take a fraction of that to let people transition. There's mad agriculture, which also finances, and it's all about how do you get people past that transition period to where they're profitable. So there are a lot of really good organizations thinking about that and offering loans and I've heard the term patient investor, like people, sometimes people are just getting a group of investors who believe in the regenerative mission and they're going to not expect returns as quickly. So land trusts to get people on land. There are just various things that are going on, but it is really hard. And there was yeah.
My husband and I lived in Arizona for some time, and there's actually a wonderful co-op in Tucson, and I saw something shocking, bizarre, I don't know. There was a guy in there, and he was at the bulk bin getting his flour grown by the Tohono O'odham people, who are some of the indigenous folks in that area, and he was wearing his MAGA hat.
Oh, wow.
Right, that's Arizona in a nutshell. May not be, which is fine. But it makes me think too of the whole Maha movement, and how there are these weird, what I would consider bizarre bedfellows in this exact sphere that we're talking about. I'm wondering if in some of the folks that you talked to and when you spoke to, did you find that, or was it the people that I normally expect and to have the viewpoints I expect, but what about that intersection?
There's definitely an intersection. And when you look at the clean living and the, getting food dyes and pesticides out, definitely a huge overlap. I know people like that exist. I would say among my subjects, it was pretty Baja free. Because it didn't intersect. But I know that's a big part of it, and it's just a bizarre thing. I don't know how to explain it. But I think wherever you can find common ground, I'm fine with that. If we all are supporting local and regional, and that was actually one of the points I was going to make. These artisanal loaves are like so expensive, but at my co-op, you can get the same locally organically milled flour and you can make your own for a fraction of it. So there are ways to get around these high prices. I'm just glad they're at the co-op buying these, local flowers. But I can't explain it, and I just hope that everyone gets along. Thank you.
Maybe one more question?
Okay, go ahead.
No, it's good.
Okay.
Yeah, forgive me if this is in the book, but whether it's positive or cautionary, do you have any predictions for 2030, 2040? All you know?
You mean like politically or?
No, just for the food system.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just telling someone the other day, we were talking about a book talk I'm going to do in the Hudson Valley. And I think about the Ralph Nader quote where he says, there's no function to pessimism. I don't know what it's going to be like, but I just think that, people have to keep doing what they're doing because the alternative is not that good. I see how outnumbered these operations are and how difficult it is. I just wrote, I have a little Substack that I started called Reaping, where I'm trying to follow along some of the stories in the book. So I have this great chapter on Greenway, which is this regenerative ocean farming. And it's really very ingenious and they're very successful in many ways. But I was trying to, again, show every link of the supply chain, including the value added part where someone is taking the kelp that is being regeneratively farmed and making a consumer packaged good with it. So she was making kelp patties, a company called Aqua. And she got millions and millions in seed money and was doing really well. But after, I think, 7 years, she closed. And she gave me a very honest postmortem of what happened. You know, there's a lot of challenges when you're at this point of a CPG startup, and the plant-based meat market tanked, and there were so many factors that sort of snowballed. But this is just one example of how hard it is. So I'm not going to say like in 2030 everything is going to be regenerative and organic. You know, the chef that I was talking to says, yeah, we've been talking about this for a really long time. And he left his restaurant because he didn't feel that it was possible to do things sourced ethically and make a living as a chef in a restaurant. So not to make this a downer, but I think it's just very hard. But there's so many people in my book who are succeeding. And so the idea was, how are these people succeeding and what are they doing that makes them successful? And you know, I think you just have to keep trying to figure this out. I really do think that policy is so important, and the government has to get behind it. And maybe the next administration will start putting more money. You know, and again, it would take a small fraction of what they're doing to uphold industrial corn and soy, so that we can basically grow animal feed for around the world. And that would make a big difference. But I think, again, you know, just people pulling their support away. You know, one of the taglines in my book is individual actions do matter. I think if we collectively, like, I'm really excited about how people are interested in this message. And, you know, the more people who try to do things, the better, and the you know, the better chance we have of changing things and really making a difference. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. That's really great.